Thank you so much for being here and having me so I can share some of the work that we have been doing. As they said, I am the creator of the Johns Hopkins Homeschool Hub, which is basically a catalog of all of the data and information on homeschool policy and participation across the United States brought together in one place so folks can easily access it. And then the research lab really uses that information to produce rigorous research on homeschooling. So what I'm sharing with you today is kind of the greatest hits of what we've been working on for the last year. I'm not going to insult you, but I am going to shake up your thinking about homeschooling and then about more education more broadly. So a lot of what we are going to be talking about in the second half of my talk appeals and has implications across all education sectors. So why should you care about homeschooling if that's not something that you're involved with? About 6% of the K-12 population in the United States is homeschooled today. Compare that to around 7% of kids in charter schools and 9 to 10% of kids in public schools, and you start to understand the magnitude of that population. Also worth mentioning that this is a single point in time estimate, which means it tells us how many kids are in homeschooling today, but it doesn't tell us anything about how many homeschool kids there were yesterday and how many will be tomorrow. If you wrongly assume that that's a pretty static group, then that really doesn't matter that much. But what I'm going to show you today is that this is a really dynamic group of students who are moving in and out of homeschooling and thereby moving in and out of other education sectors across their educational careers. So when we talk about homeschooling, our conversations really revolve around these really flawed stereotypes that then lead us down these really terrible policy paths to flawed policy. And so you're going to all be familiar with many of these, but often the common stereotypes are around race, around where these students live, that they're concentrated in rural areas. They're around religion as being the motivating factor, political ideology, that it's a conservative pursuit. And oftentimes these students are framed, or their families are framed, as somehow radical or extreme, and that's why they pursue homeschooling. And then often homeschooling is also framed as a broad rejection of traditional public schools. So we're going to look at a lot of these stereotypes today. When you think about what homeschooling looks like, most people will think, because of this supposed extreme ideology that makes people do this, that they are going to homeschool all of their many children and their big families for all years of those kids' educations at home, and that that's all going to occur with the mother doing the instruction. Turns out, though, that homeschoolers look very different than these stereotypes. So I'm going to show you a series of graphs, and I don't want you to get bogged down in all of the details. The big picture here is, does the blue bar, which represents homeschoolers, look similar to the orange bar, which represents the broader population? Okay, so chart after chart, that's what we're going to be looking for. So here's the first chart. We see diversity by race in homeschooling. So the blue bar is homeschooling, and you can see, yes, that there is an overrepresentation of white families in homeschooling. But it doesn't look exactly like what the stereotype would have you believe. It's not 90-10, right? It looks very similar to the broader population. And when we look at the other races and ethnicities, homeschooling is representative of those groups, although slightly underrepresented, but again, not like the stereotypes would have you believe. And homeschooling in Black communities and Hispanic communities is growing quickly. So here we look at race and ethnicity again. This time, though, we have it pegged against public schooling families and private schooling families. And when you look at this, you can see that homeschoolers look broadly like the rest of the population across these sectors and on race and ethnicity. Now, homeschoolers are diverse in other ways as well. This is parents responding to the survey telling us about their LGBTQ status. And so here we can see that parents who homeschool at least one child are actually more likely to say that they are LGBTQ or other than parents of private or public schooling children. Now here we're looking at income, and so the bigger slice there, the 28%, is folks that didn't report. But the key takeaway here is just seeing the diversity of socioeconomic status across homeschooling. There are lots of little pie pieces. All different types of people with different status are homeschooling. And then here I have socioeconomic status again, this time pegged again against their private and public schooling peers. And you can see that they look like the broader population across all socioeconomic strata, and that they look most similar to their publicly schooling family peers. And here we have family size. So the stereotype, of course, is that homeschool families have very large families, and those families do exist. But on average, by and large, homeschooling families have the same number of kids as the general population, 1.6 for our overall sample and 177 children for homeschool families. So not that much of a difference there, and certainly not what the stereotypes would have us believe. Homeschooling families are also dispersed across different locales. And so one of the stereotypes is that homeschooling is concentrated in rural areas. And you can see there at the end that it is concentrated and overrepresented in rural areas. But there are actually many more homeschoolers in urban and suburban sectors, right? And so this is, again, not what the stereotype would have you believe. We can go back to the rural concentration if people are interested in that in the questions. And then here we have homeschool distribution across the United States by region. Again, stereotype that you would hear is that homeschooling is a Southern pursuit. There is indeed a concentration of homeschooling in the South, but there are also a concentration of children in the South. And so, again, not exactly what the stereotype would have you believe. And clearly homeschooling is distributed across the United States by region. Homeschoolers are also diverse in other ways. So here we look at political point of view. So the common stereotype is that it's a conservative or Republican pursuit. We do see concentration of homeschooling in homeschooling families identifying as Republican or conservative, but it's not that great. 36% compared to 44%. It's not a 90-10 situation. And we have 30% of homeschooling families identifying as Democrat or liberal. We also see this kind of diversity across religious point of view. And so this question asks families how often they attend religious services. So 40% of homeschooling families attend religious services weekly, but so do 33% of the broader population, and a full 30% don't attend religious services at all. And then homeschooling is growing. This map shows the growth for 23-24. We have the new numbers for 24-25. So far, 90% of states that report are showing growth, and plotted across the United States, it's red states, blue states, coast to coast. So not only do homeschoolers look different than these stereotypes, they actually act very different than the stereotypes would have us believe. And so this is some of the work that we've been working on, looking at the dynamics of homeschooling and then how that can impact broader education. So homeschooling is not quite as dogmatic as a pursuit as people would have you believe. These are actually quite dynamic families. So in this chart down at the bottom, this is adults telling us about how they were educated 10 or 20 years ago. And these are people who say that they were homeschooled. Within the red circle there, 10% of people who were homeschooled say that they were homeschooled for all 12 years of their education. That means that 90% of people who were homeschooled were also educated in other sectors across their education careers. Now, switching to the same chart, but up to the top, if we add those numbers together, 50% of adults who said that they were homeschooled were only homeschooled for 1 to 3 years. And these folks are my first dynamic that I'll talk about. These are my switchers, right? They're switching in and out of sectors across their education careers. And I also call them my pragmatic switchers because here we see that those folks are moving in and out of public schools. If this was a dogmatic decision that they decided they weren't going to homeschool but they were going to do something else, they would move in and out of private schools or private religious schools that better met their needs. But we see here that they're moving primarily in and out of public schools. This also tells me that this is not a rejection of traditional public schooling, because we see this movement in and out of public education. Now, that data was from 10 or 20 years ago, right? What happened with children who were homeschooled 10 or 20 years ago? But maybe things are different now. So we have newer information. This is data from last spring, asking families some of these questions about how they educate their children. And this is my second dynamic group. I call these pragmatic mixers. So a mixing family is a family with 3 children. One child in that household is homeschooled for some reason, and the other children are attending other sectors, predominantly public education. So under the same household, at the same moment in time, you have children in different sectors. Here we see that in these families that are homeschooling at least one child, 35% have another child at the same time in a traditional public school. You have to understand, too, that this underestimates the total number of people who would be mixers, because you have to have 2 school-aged children in order to land in my sample there. So if you have a baby that's not quite school age, or if you have an older child that has graduated, you might be willing to be a mixer or a switcher, but those folks won't show up yet because you have to have those K-12 age kids. So 35%, that's a third. That's a lot. That's a lot of people. And then the other dynamic, and I'll get to adapters, the third dynamic I'm calling choosers choose, and we're just now working on this, but we have emerging data that show that, and it's very common sense, but when somebody chooses, they're going to continue to choose. It's not a one and done. You don't choose charter schooling and then you're finished. We have emerging evidence that families that choose for one child will choose again for that child later, become switchers, or that they will choose differently for a different child, become mixers, and that this choice is becoming more and more dynamic. And then the fourth dynamic that we're working on right now is that of adapters. So this is within homeschooling. It doesn't necessarily look like mom at the kitchen table with the kids. We have large percentages of families involved in micro schools, hybrid schools, co-ops, tutoring, virtual schools, virtual courses, part-time enrollment at the local public school, right? There's all kinds of things that people are adapting this homeschool education to support the needs of their child or their families. So my contention is that homeschoolers don't just look like the broader population. Homeschooling families are the broader population. And so what does this mean for broader school choices, right? I think that we have to understand that education in this country has changed, and that the education consumption patterns have changed. If we continue to ignore that, we are continuing to measure and discuss the wrong things and produce flawed policies. I also want to talk to you a little bit, several people brought up the NAEP. I hope that you can understand how this switching and these dynamics apply to all sectors. This is not just happening in homeschooling. We know that because they're switching in and out of other sectors. But within charter schools or magnet schools or interdistrict choice, right, those people are also probably participating in more of these dynamic choices, moving in and out of sectors. Once you accept that, it really changes everything, because we think of these as set students in public schooling students, private schooling students. If we understand that behind the scenes really all of this transitioning is happening, how do we attribute any outcome to any particular sector, right? And looking at the NAEP, I hope you can kind of connect the dots here and understand that the NAEP is not, students in homeschooling do not take the NAEP. Virtual students do not take the NAEP. Microschooling students do not take the NAEP. Hybrid students probably do not take the NAEP. Also, Tom D's missing children do not take the NAEP. We have had a structural shift, a compositional change in who takes the NAEP pre-pandemic to post-pandemic that I believe is influencing some of these negative numbers. It's not a random switch in the kinds of students, even though the people that do the analysis try to control for those differences as much as they can. You cannot control away the fact that those parents, for whatever reason, were pushed motivated, financed, resourced enough to move their child into a different sector, and those kids are no longer taking the NAEP. The kids left behind in the schools who are taking the NAEP are a different batch of kids. And so I think it has broad implications. This is something, these dynamics that we're working on, and I think it's something that's very important to consider as we're thinking about not just homeschooling policy, but education policy in the United States overall. Thank you.